Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Tonight, we return to Oakland County in the winter of the 1970s, an affluent suburb north of Detroit, where families believed their streets were safe until they weren't. This is the story of 4 children: Mark Stebbins, Jill Robinson, Kristine Mihelich, and Timothy King, abducted, held, cared for in uncanny ways, then killed and left in public view. The perpetrator came to be called the Oakland County Child Killer, or the Babysitter Killer, and to this day, there's no definitive answer. Leonard, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mara. It's heavy. I've spent decades looking at serial child abductions and the investigative responses from that era. Oakland County is one of those cases that stays with you, not just for the crimes themselves, but for what they revealed about policing, forensic limits of the time, and how communities respond to terror.
Right. So, let's start at the beginning, Leonard. Walk listeners through the first confirmed victim, Mark Stebbins. I remember, the details still make your stomach drop.
Mark Douglas Stebbins was 12. He was last seen on February 15, 1976, leaving an American Legion Hall in Ferndale and heading home. 4 days later, on February 19th, his body was found in a Southfield office parking lot, in plain view on a pile of wood and dirt. He'd been strangled, sexually assaulted with a foreign object, and had rope marks on his wrists and ankles. Yet his body was clean. His clothes had been washed. He'd been bathed and, it appears, cared for while in captivity. That mixture of care and brutality is chilling.
Yeah, that detail, the bathing, the washing of clothes, it's what earned the killer that nickname, the Babysitter. It's almost obscene. A person who cleaned a child's fingernails and then
took their life. It suggests a particular kind of offender psychology, someone exerting control through caretaking who alternates nurturing behavior with extreme violence. It's a pattern we've seen in some other child killers, but the public staging, leaving the body where people could find it, adds another layer of intent. It's almost like a performance.
Mark's murder would be the first, but it wouldn't be the last. Jill Robinson goes next, or rather, she's next in the timeline of confirmed victims. Jill was 12 as well. She was from Royal Oak, and on December 22, 1976, after an argument with her mother about making biscuits for dinner, she left on her bicycle, headed toward her father's house. Her bike turned up the next day behind a hobby store. 4 days later, on December 26th, Jill's body was found next to I-75 in Troy, within sight of the Troy police station. She was fully clothed, still wearing her backpack, and she'd been shot in the face with a 12-gauge shotgun. Autopsy suggested she'd been fed and cared for at least 3 days before she was killed.
Jill's method of killing is an anomaly within the cluster. The other confirmed victims were strangled or smothered: Mark, Kristine, and Tim. Jill was shot. That has led some investigators to question whether Jill was killed by the same offender. But there are counterpoints. The captivity period, the way her body was dumped in public view, the care she apparently received in the days before her death, these are consistent with the broader pattern. So it's a debate that never quite resolves cleanly.
By the way, Leonard, people sometimes call this case the snow killer too, right? Because bodies were often left on or near snowbanks.
Exactly. The public display on snowbanks or roadside was notable and added to the chilling media image of the case. The names Babysitter, Snow Killer come from those very specific and disturbing details.
Let's move to January 1977. Kristine Mihelich, Christy, age 10. Listeners, by this point, 2 children had already been abducted and killed, but the pattern hadn't yet crystallized in the public mind. Kristine disappears on January 2nd after going to a 7-Eleven to buy a magazine with permission. 19 days later, on January 21, a postal worker found her body along a rural road in Franklin Village. She'd been smothered, and crucially, autopsy suggested she was killed less than 24 hours before being found, meaning she'd been alive for most of those 19 days. Again, bathed, groomed, clothes washed, and redressed.
And that prolonged captivity is one of the case's most unnerving signatures. Holding a child for days, even weeks, without neighbors noticing, then returning them to public view, it raises questions about the offender's mobility, access to private space, and the potential for help or an accommodating environment. Did he have a house, a shared safe room, or help? That debate, lone offender versus network, is a major unresolved question in the case.
Which brings us to Tim King, whose case really galvanized the community. Tim was 11. On March 16, 1977, he borrows money from his sister and rides his skateboard to a neighborhood pharmacy to buy candy. A witness saw a boy talking to a man in the parking lot. The witness described a white male, 25 to 35, with shaggy hair and sideburns. They also reported seeing a blue AMC gremlin with a white stripe, and the gremlin would become a focal point. 6 days later, on March 22nd, 2 teenagers found Tim's body in a shallow ditch on Gill Road in Livonia. He'd been suffocated and sexually assaulted with a foreign object. He'd eaten Kentucky Fried Chicken shortly before he died. And, once again, he was clean, with trimmed nails, bathed, and groomed. People in the community were beside themselves.
Tim's murder pushed authorities to recognize a serial pattern. Similarly aged children, abducted from normal suburban locations, Legion Hall, a bike ride, a 7-Eleven, a local pharmacy, held for days, carefully attended to, then killed and placed where they'd be found. The Michigan State Police convened a task force that included 13 local jurisdictions. At the time, it became the largest murder investigation in U.S. history in terms of agencies and resources involved.
Over 18,000 tips were checked. Every owner of a blue AMC gremlin in the region was questioned. Thousands interviewed. Hundreds of suspects considered. And yet, by December 1978, the task force was disbanded. For families, that lack felt like abandonment.
There are a couple layers to that disbanding. On one hand, it reflected resource and jurisdictional frustrations in the late 1970s, forensic limits, interagency friction. On the other hand, families saw it as lawyers and officials checking out. The investigators who remained maintained a cold case unit, but the momentum of those early years dissipated. That's when these unresolved suspicions about missteps and possible cover-ups began to harden.
We should slow down and be clear. Officially, there are 4 confirmed OCCK victims: Mark, Jill, Kristine, and Tim. Other cases were examined or suspected, like Donna Sarah from 1972, Janie Allen in 1976, and several others that investigators later ruled out: Judy Farrow, Cynthia Cadu, Sheila Srock. The task force tried to narrow the pattern to these 4 while still investigating others. Those rulings contributed, though, to public skepticism. Why could some similar cases be closed while these 4 remained unsolved?
It's a fair question. Some cases had distinct evidence pointing to a specific perpetrator, including confessions or ballistic matches. The OCC cases, though, involved limited physical evidence by modern standards, complicated by the 1970s forensic capabilities. That scarcity made conclusive links harder. But there were enough similarities to justify treating the 4 as a cluster and to mount the massive task force response.
Let's talk about suspects and theories. This is where the case becomes foggy, and where families and reporters collide with official investigations. There's the Alan and Frank letter, an anonymous tip to a psychiatrist on the task force, spelling errors, a man claiming to be a sadomasochistic slave of the killer, calling the killer Frank, and alleging Vietnam service. Investigators chased that lead, but ultimately nothing definitive came of it. It could have been a hoax. It could have been someone with inside knowledge. We don't know.
The Allen-Frank correspondence is the kind of material that inflames speculation. It provided evocative but unverifiable detail, a supposed war connection, a motive tied to Vietnam trauma. Investigative psychology sometimes treats such letters cautiously. They can be a real confession or a hoax seeking attention. The lack of a corroborated identity for Alan or Frank leaves the letter in the category of uncertain evidence.
Then there's North Fox Island, the child pornography ring discovered in the investigation called Brother Paul's Children's Mission. It uncovered a multi-state ring of abuse and pornography. Some researchers and families suspected links between that ring and the Oakland County murders. The ring had overlapping victim profiles and Michigan connections, but no public, conclusive tie to the 4 confirmed OCCK murders. Still, it made the idea of a lone killer less tidy.
Right. The discovery of an organized child exploitation operation naturally pushes the possibility that the murders were either facilitated by or connected to a broader network. The Fox Island revelations and later exposures of groups like the Cass Corridor Ring expanded the plausible range of scenarios, from a solitary sadist to a group of offenders sharing victims, transport, or safe houses. The presence of multiple abusive actors in the region complicates the idea of a single, isolated perpetrator.
Speaking of the Cass Corridor Ring and related arrests, that brings up Ted Lamborghini and Richard Lawson. Lamborghini, a retired auto worker, and Lawson were convicted in the 2000s for sexually assaulting boys in the 1970s. In 2007, Lamborghini was called a top suspect by investigators who spoke to Detroit TV, but he was never charged with the Oakland County murders. The Stebbins family even filed a wrongful death lawsuit against him. He refused a polygraph offered as part of a plea deal. That refusal, people read a lot into that. But again, no direct DNA link publicly released tying him to the murders.
That's important. Refusal to cooperate or take polygraphs can look damning to the public, but it's not proof in court. Lamborghini's history of child sexual abuse makes him a plausible suspect to many. Prosecutors face the gap between plausible and provable, and in high-profile cold cases, sometimes the evidence falls short of what's needed for criminal charges.
Then there's Christopher Brian Bush, son of a GM executive. His name shows up a lot in the family-driven investigations. He had history of sexual offenses and child pornography. In 1978, Bush was found dead of an apparent suicide. Investigators later found blood-stained ligatures and a hand-drawn image reminiscent of Mark Stebbins in his apartment. No confirmed OCCK killings occurred after his death, which led some to believe the series ended with him. Families, especially Tim King's, pushed hard, arguing Bush was shielded because of his family ties. But then, in 2012, authorities announced DNA testing excluded Bush as the source of biological material linked to the cases. That was a big public moment.
Bush's case is a textbook illustration of the intersection of suspicion, privilege, and forensic progress. For families, circumstantial details, the image on the wall, the ligatures, his history, were enough to suspect. For investigators, DNA exclusion is powerful, though not necessarily the last word. DNA excludes him from the specific biological material tested, but it doesn't resolve the questions of possible complicity or whether he was part of a network where others might carry physical traces. Still, the 2012 exclusion shifted official focus away from Bush as a prime suspect.
Another figure is Arch Edward Sloan. In 2012, mitochondrial DNA testing found hair in Sloan's 1966 Pontiac that matched mitochondrial DNA profiles from hair on at least one OCCK victim. Key nuance: the DNA did not match Sloan himself. So investigators argued someone else, possibly the killer, had used Sloan's car. Sloan also failed polygraphs in 2010 and 2012, according to reporting. The hair connection made Sloan an important person of interest, but mitochondrial DNA isn't uniquely identifying. It can point to a matrilineal line, but it doesn't single someone out like nuclear DNA.
Exactly. Mitochondrial DNA can narrow a field. It can tell you that the person who shed that hair shares a maternal lineage with a group. But it cannot point with certainty to an individual the way autosomal DNA can. The Sloan car finding is intriguing because it ties the victim's hairs to a vehicle linked to a convicted child sex offender. It opens the possibility that the killer used that car or that a network shared vehicles. But scientifically, it's not a smoking gun.
And then there's the whole anonymous figure called Jeff, who appears in the 2010s, saying he and dozens of other investigators could identify the killer and link the OCCK victims to far more murders, up to 11 to 16. He insisted he couldn't release the name until certain files were shared with him. Attorney Paul Hughes used some of what Jeff claimed in a $100 million lawsuit alleging officials had mishandled the case. The lawsuit was dismissed. Jeff never revealed a name. His credibility is deeply disputed. It's one of those chapters where outside actors, family advocates, media, and law enforcement collide, and it gets messy.
When anonymous tips of that magnitude appear, they can create both pressure and confusion. They sometimes spur new searches, sometimes distract from verifiable leads. Without corroboration, they're not sufficient to overturn investigative conclusions. But they do reflect the desperation of families and advocates who feel institutional answers are insufficient.
Let's talk for a minute about the forensic arc. The case started in an era with no DNA databases, no CODIS, no genetic genealogy. Evidence was collected: ligatures, hairs, fibers, and preserved. Decades later, renewed interest and modern DNA testing allowed for new analysis. That led to both exclusions, like Bush, and possible links, like the mitochondrial hair matches connected to Sloan's car. Investigators say they've developed a DNA profile believed to be from the killer or his close associate, But as of early 2026, no direct match in databases has produced an arrest. The case remains open.
That's a key point. Modern forensics has altered how cold cases can be approached, but it doesn't always mean an arrest follows. A viable DNA profile without a database match leaves you with a genetic ghost. Genetic genealogy has solved many cold cases, but it relies on matches in public or commercial databases and a lot of painstaking pedigree work. Oakland County's evidence has yielded leads, mitochondrial matches, and exclusions, but not that one decisive tie.
And listeners should know, the case also helped uncover other crimes. The task force revealed a child pornography ring tied to North Fox Island. And decades later, reporting exposed other sex rings, like the Cass Corridor Group. That proliferation of offending actors in the region makes the network theory harder to dismiss outright. Leonard, do you lean lone killer or network?
I always lean into evidence. The OCCK pattern, consistent grooming, staging, victim profile, timing, can be explained by a single offender who had the means and privacy to hold victims. But there are signals that point to more complexity. Multiple convicted pedophiles operating in the same region at the same time. The Fox Island ring. Sloane's car harboring hair that matches victim hairs but not Sloane, and the way suspects with privilege seem to elude scrutiny in families' eyes. The most likely reality, in my view, is a primary offender who had enablers, people who helped, sheltered, or at least knew more than they disclosed. That would explain both the pattern and the occasional anomalies.
I agree. The truth may be hybrid. A central killer with access to others, or a group with a dominant perpetrator. That ambiguity feeds decades of grief and suspicion. Families, particularly Tim's, Barry King and his sister Catherine Broad, turned into public advocates and relentless archivists of files. Catherine runs an extensive blog and archive. Barry kept pushing for DNA testing and transparency. They say vital materials were withheld or heavily redacted for decades. Deborah Jarvis, Kristine's mother, also became a public plaintiff in efforts to force disclosure. The families became investigators in their own right.
That transformation of families into advocates is a pattern we see frequently in cold cases where official answers stall. It's born out of grief and mistrust. Families often produce substantial new leads or pressure agencies to retest evidence with modern methods. But it also creates friction because investigators feel their work is being second-guessed publicly. That friction sometimes masks real institutional failures and sometimes obscures responsible investigative choices.
And there's a long, ugly theme in this story. Allegations of political protection. Bush was the son of a high-level GM exec. Families and journalists have alleged that influential circles shielded suspects. Authorities deny intentional cover-ups. But whether or not there was a formal conspiracy, the perception of protection, especially when records were slow to be released, caused long-lasting damage. People lost trust.
Perception matters. In high-profile crimes involving wealthy or well-connected figures, even routine caution by investigators can look like favoritism. It's also true that if you have heavy involvement by multiple agencies, poor record sharing, and evidence collection standards that don't align across jurisdictions, legitimate bungling occurs. That can be interpreted, not always unfairly, as concealment. This case sits at the intersection of real procedural limits and very credible allegations of mismanagement.
Before we move on, a word about media and culture. The case led to intense media coverage at the time, a radio special that won a Peabody, And decades later, documentaries like Children of the Snow on Investigation Discovery and Hulu, books like Tommy McIntyre's Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, and J. Reuben Appelman's The Kill Jar dug deeper. Heather Catallo's reporting for WXYZ brought new attention to Sloan and polygraphs. Media helped keep the story alive, sometimes clarifying, sometimes complicating. But it kept pressure on the authorities and kept the family's grief in the public eye.
Absolutely. Investigative journalism can be a corrective when institutions stumble. It can also fuel speculation. In Oakland County's case, journalists unearthed records, published DNA developments, and amplified family demands. That's part of why new testing happened. Media attention kept the cold case from being buried entirely.
Let's pause for a moment and reflect on what the murders did to parenting and community, cultural impact. These were suburban families, middle class. The 1970s image of kids riding bikes or walking to the store began to change here. After these murders, parents kept kids inside. Curfews became enforced. Stranger danger became a daily fear. Tim King's family and others channeled their grief into activism, but the community's everyday life was altered in ways that lasted decades.
By the 1980s, the broader cultural shift towards supervised childhood, fewer unsupervised walks and bike rides, was well underway. Occurrences like OCCK help explain that shift. The traumatic effect of a killer who targeted ordinary activities, a boy on a skateboard, a girl on a bicycle, a child going to a 7-Eleven, created a sense that even mundane environments were unsafe. That kind of fear reshapes parenting norms permanently.
We should also talk about the profile investigators painted. The likely offender was thought to be a white male in his mid-20s to mid-30s at the time, so in 2026, he'd be in his late 60s or 70s, comfortable with children, able to gain their trust quickly, with access to a vehicle and private space, maybe military background. The Allen letter claims Vietnam service, though that's unconfirmed. There's this ritual element: bathing, grooming, then killing, and public staging. That ritual suggests deep control impulses and possibly ritualized gratification.
Yes, the bathing and grooming are especially interesting from a clinical perspective. They can indicate a desire to assert dominance through intimate acts of care, washing, trimming, then exercising ultimate control through killing. It's a disturbing behavioral signature that could help narrow suspect pools. Offenders who present as nurturing or trustworthy to kids, who have privacy and the time to hold victims. But again, that could describe multiple people, which is part of why investigators have struggled to pin an identity on the offender.
You mentioned earlier that investigators developed a DNA profile thought to belong to the killer or a close associate. They haven't found a direct match, but mitochondrial matches do tie some evidence to Sloan's car. DNA excluded Bush. Some other suspects, like Lamborghini, were named publicly as persons of interest, but not charged for these murders. That leaves us in this painful middle ground: credible leads, but not a court case. Leonard, what would it take to finally close this? A direct autosomal DNA match in a database? A confession? Something else?
A direct autosomal DNA match to a living person in an accessible database would be the cleanest path to prosecution. Alternatively, a reliable living witness or cooperator providing corroborated information, for instance, someone who could place the suspect with the victims at specific times, with physical evidence to back it up, could lead to charges. A confession would have to be corroborated by material facts known only to the killer. In cold cases, we also see eventual resolutions through combinations. DNA leads that point to a family, then genealogical work to a suspect, followed by search warrants that produce corroborative material or a confession. Until you get that combination, prosecution is difficult.
And part of the tragedy is the timeline. Suspects age, witnesses die, memories fade, records disappear or degrade. Families age too, carrying unresolved grief. Catherine Broad has been relentless in keeping Tim's story alive through archives and public pressure. Barry King keeps pushing for the files. Deborah Jarvis fought for Kristine's family. They kept the case in the public for decades. And we have to acknowledge how that persistence has shaped our ability to keep working on cold cases more broadly.
Indeed. Family advocacy has forced law enforcement agencies to adapt, to rethink evidence preservation, to retest items with modern methods, to be more transparent when they can. The pain and persistence of families often become the engine that pushes cold cases into modern forensic eras. But it's a heavy burden, carrying public grief while pushing for legal redress.
Listeners, we're going to move through a few more thematic questions before we wrap. First, the lone killer versus network debate. We've said the answer may be both. Evidence supports a primary offender with possible helpers or enablers. The discovery of organized child pornography on Fox Island and the presence of other sex rings in the region make it highly plausible that the killer had contact with others who facilitated or enabled crimes. The Sloan hair in the car is one physical piece that points to shared spaces or vehicles. But without an autosomal DNA match, we're not there.
Right. From an investigative and psychological standpoint, a hybrid model explains many puzzles. The ability to hold children for long periods suggests access to private spaces that another person could provide. Shared networks would also explain why multiple offenders with overlapping victim histories existed in the region. At the same time, a single perpetrator could have done the killings, using contacts for logistics. Both configurations remain plausible.
Second question. Missteps and structural limitations. The 1970s lacked DNA, and different jurisdictions often had competing priorities. Some families accuse investigators of mishandling or withholding records, and there are allegations of protecting the influential. Investigators deny intentional cover-ups. Leonard, how do we hold both truths, procedural chaos and possible institutional bias, at once?
We need nuance. Procedural shortcomings were real. Primitive forensics, inconsistent evidence cataloging, and interagency rivalry. Those things alone can doom a case. At the same time, when suspects are wealthy or connected, even routine investigative caution can look like bias. Families are right to demand transparency. But proving intentional protection requires evidence beyond reasonable suspicion, and those proof standards are exactly what investigators lacked in many of these leads. The remedy should be more transparency, better preservation, and continued scientific testing so that trust can be rebuilt from tangible results.
A third theme, the cultural echo. Cases like OCCK shifted childhood. They also changed how we think about serial offenders. The idea that someone could prey on the mundane routine of kids in broad daylight shook suburban America. You said earlier that the killer's ability to put kids at ease, to seem trustworthy, was probably central. That's the scariest thing to parents, not shadowy strangers at night, but ordinary men who seemed harmless.
Yes. Offenders who appear normal or trustworthy are often the most dangerous precisely because they can operate within ordinary social structures without raising alarm. That's one reason prevention strategies evolved to focus on situational awareness, community supervision, and parental vigilance, rather than treating danger as something only in dark alleys.
All right, before we close, a few practical things. There are a number of solid resources for anyone who wants to study this further. Catherine Broad's OCCK archive, the OCCK.info repository, Heather Catallo's WXYZ reporting, Tommy McIntyre's Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, the documentary Children of the Snow. These sources have been invaluable in keeping the investigative record alive and making documents available for independent researchers. Leonard, is there a last analytic thought you want our listeners to take away?
Yes. Cold cases like this are painful because they're unresolved, leaving a community suspended between what we know and what we fear. But science has advanced. Evidence that sat unanalyzed for decades can now be probed in ways the 1970s couldn't imagine. That gives real hope. Coupled with persistent families and investigative journalists, that scientific capacity means answers are still possible. We must keep pressure for thorough, transparent testing, and remember that even in old cases, modern techniques have a way of producing new truths.
I want to end this episode where I started, with the children. Mark, Jill, Kristine, Tim. Each one was a child of a community. Each had a family left with a hole that never closes. This case taught a generation to fear the ordinary, and it left a legacy of suspicion, activism, and the endless pursuit of truth. The task force once called it the largest organized murder investigation in U.S. history. Yet, for all that scale, there's no final answer. That's why we keep coming back to it. Leonard, thank you. For our listeners with ties to Oakland County, we know this hits deep. Thank you for holding these kids in memory with us.
Thank you, Mara. And to listeners, if you're looking into the case, use the family archives and reputable reporting. Treat anonymous tips with caution. And above all, remember the human toll behind the headline.
We'll be back next week with another Still Unanswered. If you want to dive deeper into documents or follow the families who keep this work alive, check the show notes for links to Catherine Broad's archive, OCCK.info, Heather Catallo's series, and the books and documentary we mentioned. I'm Mara Ellison. Good night.